Growing up in a strict Roman Catholic family, John Pomeroy always wanted to help others.
I toured a seminary and considered becoming a priest. Before college, I started dating, and I realized I couldn't be a priest because I was interested in girls.
So at age 24, living in Covina, California, John put his philanthropy to work in another way.
I was a house parent at a home for kids who are orphaned. I loved it a lot.
John enjoyed the work, especially when an attractive woman named Tina Hambleton joined the team in the fall of 1987.
The first time I saw Tina, I thought, oh, she's attractive. And I wonder who that is.
John was instantly smitten, so he mustered up the courage to ask Tina out. But he was quickly shot down.
Tina told me that she wouldn't date me because we weren't of the same faith. I was Catholic, and she was a born-again Christian, and she was only going to date somebody who was a born-again Christian. At that point, I realized, okay, we're just going to be friends.
Soon their friendship grew, and Tina confided in John about her troubled past.
Tina told me that she had been a drug addict until about 3 years before we met. I thought, that's interesting. I've never known anybody who's used drugs like that.
Tina was very open about her past because she shared it as a testimony to other women and how she had overcome those things.
A true believer in second chances, John was inspired by Tina's transformation and curious about the church she attended.
I had begun to become restless in my faith as a Catholic, and she told me about her church. She invited me to some young adult meetings.
John was moved by the ministry, and on Easter Sunday of 1988, he became a member of Tina's church. Suddenly, Tina began to look at John Pomeroy in a different light.
She began to look at me as a person that could be dated.
But Tina's life as a devout Christian included some ground rules that she told John she wouldn't break.
Tina always said from her past she did not like the use of alcohol or pain medications. So she was really opposed to those kind of things.
She said we could drink no alcohol, we could have no sex before marriage. But I saw the spiritual value to these rules, so I didn't fight them.
John respected Tina's wishes and knew she was the right girl for him. A year later, the couple was married at their church in Whittier, California.
When we were saying our vows, this promise to each other and to God, it was very, very important to me. I was making a commitment for the rest of my life.
Almost immediately, their lives together took off. John became a police officer in Pomona, and Tina became pregnant right away.
We didn't have a normal honeymoon stage. It was get married, go to work at this intense job, and get ready for a baby to come.
When their son Michael was born in 1990, Tina quit her job to become a full-time mom, and John had a new home built for the family.
I was very happy being a father and a husband. I had this beautiful wife who was a good Christian woman.
But 13 years into their marriage, it seemed that Tina had found another calling. And before long, their good life together would crumble. On the morning of May 28, 2002, John's cell phone rang while he was at work.
This woman called and told me that she knew my wife and she knew my kids. I didn't recognize her voice.
John continued to listen as the mysterious woman told him something that would send him running for his life.
And she said that somebody was trying to kill me. And, I was shocked.
Tina had gone so far down, so fast.
In the winter of 1995, 7 years before a dire phone call would have Detective John Pomeroy fearing for his life, he and his wife Tina welcomed the birth of their second son, Brandon.
Tina, the boys and I were very close. We would go on vacations, usually to coastline destinations, Long Beach, San Diego, Newport Beach. We did a lot of stuff together.
They had everything that a family could need and want. They were role modeling their marriage to other couples.
But by the summer of 2000, 11 years into their marriage, John began to notice troubling changes in Tina's behavior.
I saw Tina being more irritable. She seemed to be always angry with me, and her personality was changing.
Tina started to take a little bit of a turn. A lot of depression started to set in. It seemed like she was just there, but not there most of the time.
Sometimes she would leave and be gone till 3 o'clock, 2 o'clock in the morning. And my dad was the one who was there helping take care of us, put us to bed, It was weird.
I would always ask her where she was going, and she would just tell me it was none of my business. I really didn't know what I could do to stop it.
And around that time, according to John, their money was quickly disappearing.
I would go to the supermarket, and there was no money in my account.
By the winter of 2000, the situation hadn't improved. John had no choice but to file for bankruptcy. He had no idea what to do next. And by the following year, he saw yet another disturbing side to his wife.
She would occasionally slap me or hit me. My father taught me never to raise a hand to a woman, and I just took the hits.
Tina's actions made one thing clear to John.
I suspected that she was using illegal drugs. There were some strange behaviors that were going on that I couldn't explain, and she was beginning to lose weight.
As a good Christian, John did what he could to hang on to his marriage. He moved out of their bedroom into their home office and pleaded with Tina to get the help it appeared she needed.
I asked her to go to the rehab facility where she first got cleaned on drugs, and she just kept telling me no. She didn't have a problem.
He was trying to keep his family together, and that was his goal and his focus. But Tina was not going to let that happen.
In the summer of 2001, Tina took a job as a counselor at a drug education program for teens. Good friend Rhonda Morkin founded the program and hired Tina.
So Tina came to me at that time and asked, if there was any way she could get paid. There were many problems that they were having, so they needed the money. So I said, well, come on, I can hire you on part-time.
John hoped her new job was a sign that Tina was on the road to recovery. But he couldn't have been more wrong. In July 2001, Tina and John got into a heated argument.
I don't recall what it was, but Tina started arguing with me. She hit me in front of the kids. I mean, it was like a light switch for me. I realized I need to get out. I need to get out of this marriage.
Devastated, John moved out of the house and into the basement of the Pomona police station.
I didn't feel like I could confide to anybody what was going on. I was ashamed as a man, as a police officer, to admit that I was a victim of physical violence, domestic violence.
With no legal right to take their children, John vowed to return for them as soon as he could.
I felt terrible about leaving my boys. I felt like I was abandoning them. I couldn't tell them the history of the violence.
I don't want to say I felt like my dad abandoned me, but it was very easily put to me from my mother that my dad had just up and left, and he didn't care about us.
I thought maybe Tina would think about the kids because there wouldn't be me there to keep everything together, and that she might get her life back in order.
But it wasn't meant to be. Tina's destructive behavior was about to reach a whole new level.
I was in shock. I said, you have got to be kidding me.
I couldn't believe that she would go to that extreme. It's just unbelievable.
In the summer of 2001, John Pomeroy moved out of his house with the hope that his wife Tina would quickly come to her senses.
I thought that I was enabling her to remain irresponsible, and that if I left, that she might snap out of it and get her act together.
But within weeks, Tina was fired from the drug education program where she worked.
She started to not show up for work. She would come to me, she wanted to borrow money. We had several talks with her about her behaviors during that time. And I saw the change in Tina was not the Tina that I knew at all. So it was time for us to let her go.
John saw no end in sight to his wife's downward spiral. On September 11th, 2001, he filed for divorce and joint custody of their 2 boys.
I knew that there was no going back to her, that there is no way that our marriage would ever be reconciled. I knew it was over.
By April of 2002, John moved into his own apartment, but he was worried about the welfare of their children.
The boys would tell me that there was no electricity at the house. There was no running water at the house. I was really angry that she was exposing our boys to that environment.
At a certain point, you look at the house and you say, there's nothing here that's conducive to a good upbringing.
To make matters worse, John suspected that Tina was hanging around members of a notorious biker gang who lived down the street from their home.
The boys started telling me about certain people who were coming to the house, and we knew that they were members of a motorcycle gang.
I knew a lot about all the gangs in the area. They were into drugs, crime, sexual assaults, I mean, everything that you can think of.
I had already decided that I wanted to get custody of the boys, but that ramped it up for me.
That May, John was awarded temporary custody of his children that would become final within a month.
All I wanted was the boys. I told her that she could have the house, she could have all the property in the house, that I would pay spousal support, and that I would even include child support if the boys could just live with me.
But Tina had another arrangement in mind. On the morning of May 28, 2002, John was at his desk at work when he received a strange call from an unknown woman. The woman told John she knew Tina and their boys, and then she dropped a bombshell.
She told me that Tina was trying to hire a hitman to kill me. I was totally shocked. I never thought that she'd go that far. And I realized that she could be giving me evidence of a crime. I had a tape recorder attached to my phone. So I turned on the tape recorder, and I began interviewing her the way I would interview any other witness to a crime.
As John recorded the conversation, the woman informed him that she was related to a member of the biker gang near their home.
So she told me Tina was hoping that this woman could get them to kill me.
The woman declined and never told the other gang members. Instead, she called John. She agreed to give a formal statement and help police with the investigation in any way she could.
So I went to my supervisors. I gave them the tape recording. Everything that this woman said was verifiable information.
With the help of the informant, the sheriff's office in San Bernardino County, where Tina lived, immediately set up a sting operation to catch her in the act.
The undercover detectives came up with a plan of how to use this woman to arrange a meeting with Tina and convince Tina that these undercover detectives were a hitman and his partner.
Meanwhile, John and his kids were quickly moved to an undisclosed location.
One day my dad comes to me and he says, you know, we're going to go on a little short mini vacation and we're going to stay at a hotel for a few days. It's going to be fun.
We went into hiding, and I had to tell the boys that we were playing a game for my job. I had lied to my boys.
All the while, John had no idea if Tina had already hired someone else to kill him. He was taking no chances.
I stayed awake all night long, worried that somebody was going to try and break down the door and come in to hurt me. So I just sat in a chair facing the door with a shotgun and a couple of handguns, waiting for somebody.
If you have a story of marriage gone wrong and would like to appear on this series, go to investigation.discovery.com. On May 28, 2002, after learning that his wife of 13 years was trying to hire a hitman to kill him, John Pomeroy was hiding out at a safe house with his sons.
I was sitting in a chair, facing the front door with a shotgun. I was prepared to shoot it out if I had to.
The following afternoon, police sent 2 undercover detectives posing as members of the biker gang to meet with Tina Pomeroy.
The San Bernardino Sheriff's Department had an undercover officer go in. He wore a wire and got this recorded on 2 different occasions where Tina asked this person, which was an undercover deputy, to kill John, and she even told him that John was a Pomona police officer.
She agreed to pay them $2,500, and she was going to make a drug run for them. She was also going to provide the gun that was going to be used.
And let down by my mom. I felt like she really betrayed not only my father, but, myself, Brandon.
On January 7th, 2003, Tina pleaded guilty and was given a 3-year sentence. She served 22 months in prison and was released in the winter of 2004.
That was nothing for what she had planned and what she was going to carry out. I think she should have got at least 10 years. I mean, she honestly deserved that time.
On June 3rd, 2004, John and Tina's divorce became final. But a loophole in the California divorce laws meant that Tina was still entitled to half of John's assets and pension, totaling almost $70,000.
It's just a slap in the face that this woman was entitled to any money at all.
I thought this was absolutely ludicrous for her to get half of his retirement and half of his deferred compensation money. And anything else that he had, she gets half of everything. That was completely wrong.
Furious, John went to lawmakers to get even.
I went to my local assemblyman. I wrote him a letter talking about the situation and why I believed the law needed to be changed.
Following her release, Tina was arrested for theft, a DUI, and drug possession. So in 2006, the courts gave John and his 2 boys a restraining order against her for 5 years.
It was my belief that because Tina's behavior with drugs was back, and knowing what her state of mind was, I felt that there was probably more of a danger to my family than before.
According to John, Tina has never once apologized or shown remorse for what she did.
My mom would never admit to actually anything. She would only say, I am sorry for being away. That's what you're sorry for. You're not sorry for your actions. You're not sorry that you tried to do something totally heinous towards my father. And it was very upsetting.
In July of 2010, John finally succeeded in getting the California divorce law changed. The Hitman Bill was signed and went into effect on January 1st, 2011. But John did not get reimbursed for what he had already paid to Tina.
The satisfaction from getting the law changed was not about getting anything for me. It was about preventing this kind of trauma from happening to anybody else in the future.
Today, John is still a detective and is closer than ever to his 2 boys.
They've grown up a lot through this. Michael's 21, he's going to college. Brandon's 16, he's playing ball in high school. He's loving his teenage years.
My father could have gone completely downhill after the whole situation with my mom, but yet he didn't. He became something more than just a victim of my mom. He's become stronger.
Through his faith, John has been able to forgive Tina for what she did, but he will never forget.
I don't believe it's our role on earth to forgive and forget. It's our job to forgive and live more wisely.
John credits therapy with helping him regain his life and continue raising his 2 sons.
This experience helped me to focus on what's really important, and what's really important is not things, it's people. I've got a better life than I ever had before. So I'm a very blessed man.
Eldon Bowen's life was never complete without a special lady in it.
Well, Well, I think a woman is the best thing that God has ever created. Every man wants a woman in his life.
Twice widowed by age 55, the Virginia gentleman felt like a fish out of water when it came to dating.
I was very curious about ever getting involved with another woman. And, I stayed single for a long time, but, a man gets lonesome after a while.
By the winter of 2003, Eldon knew he was ready for a special someone, so he decided to ask a friend for some help.
And I said, I got to find me a good woman, somebody to spend my time with. And he said, well, I know a real nice lady. She's a churchgoer. I said, well, how about introduce me?
Her name was Shirley Casara. Eldon wasted no time asking her out for coffee.
Well, when I first saw her, I said, damn, she's a tiny little thing. She was about 8 years older than me, but, she was a very attractive lady.
And she was cute. She was. She was real petite, real small, real soft-spoken.
I said, damn, I said, this might be what I'm looking for.
As Eldon and Shirley got to know each other, they realized they had one thing in common. They had both been unlucky in love.
She told me that she'd been married 3 times. Well, she said her husband before me was a very mean and abusive person. Said they're always picking on her, pushing her, wouldn't let her do this, wouldn't let her do that, was very controlling.
The news threw Eldon for a loop.
I felt sorry for her. I said, how can anybody be abusive to somebody this small and this fragile?
Before he knew it, Eldon was falling in love.
Our relationship was great, you couldn't ask for anything better.
That Christmas Eve, Eldon and Shirley made it official. They were married in a quaint country chapel.
She was beautiful. She had on a nice suit. She looked fabulous to me. I was real happy that we got married and we went back home and we was teenagers again,
Eldon was on cloud 9, and he was more than happy to give his new wife anything she wanted. So when Shirley asked that he add her name to the deed on his house, Eldon didn't hesitate to say yes, and he didn't stop there.
She had her checking account and I had mine. I said, well, I really don't want to get on your checking account. I said, but I would like to put you on mine, and that way you can pay the bills and stuff when I'm not here.
It seemed like a good idea at the time.
I loved her, and she was my wife. And if you ain't got love and trust in a marriage, then you don't have nothing.
But just 2 months later, Eldon began to see a whole new side of his sweet little wife.
Shirley, she started changing like a different person. And it was just almost like it was overnight.
It just seemed like the real her was coming out.
Shirley suddenly morphed from adorable to angry.
And she was screaming and yelling, cussing me, calling me everything in the world.
I told my dad that something wasn't right.
Who was Shirley Casara, really? It wouldn't be long before everyone would learn the disturbing truth.
I never thought you had to check somebody's record before you marry them.
You just don't think people are going to be like that, especially nice little old ladies.
By early 2005, Eldon Bowen was sure he'd hit the gold mine with his new wife, Shirley.
She was an excellent cook. She kept the house nice, and, I couldn't ask for anything better.
But the honeymoon was short-lived. Just 2 months after saying I do, things quickly went downhill for the newlyweds.
Well, as soon as I put her name on the deed and one of my checking accounts, well, that's when she started changing.
My dad told me that they were arguing a little bit more and things weren't going right, and he told me that it just seemed like she was trying to start an argument, over nothing.
I come home one evening, after having a beer with my friends, and to me it was no big deal being 10, 20 minutes late. Well, she flew off the handle. She had supper on the stove, got mad, dumps everything in the sink. I said, well, maybe she's having a bad day, But
Shirley's bad days quickly began to outnumber her good ones.
which would follow him around. Even if he'd go out and get on the lawnmower and cut grass, she'd be walking beside the lawnmower fussing with him.
We're no bigger than what she was. She would get right up in your face. She had a temper. She would cuss when she was mad. But then she'd go to church on Sunday and everything was forgiven.
Eldon didn't know what to make of Shirley's bizarre mood swings. And as the weeks wore on, things just went from bad to worse.
We got in a heated discussion one day. I said, I really don't want to argue about it. So when I got out of the shower, she was gone.
Eldon got dressed and went outside, and that's when he got a nasty surprise. Someone had keyed his truck. Eldon suspected Shirley.
She got back, and I was a little hot about that.
Shirley flatly denied it and blamed the damage on neighborhood kids. But Eldon wasn't buying it.
We lived in a nice neighborhood, and I've never had no kids come in my driveway to do something like that. I said, yeah, some big damn kid with attitude.
Despite his misgivings, Eldon brushed the incident off. He could never have guessed what would happen just a few weeks later.
I was watching something on TV, and she was getting in front of the TV, wanted to talk. I said, well, we can talk, but I'm not going to argue. Well, you think more about that blank TV than you do me. I said, well, at this point, yes, I do.
Frustrated, Eldon went outside to collect his thoughts. A few minutes later, he was surprised to see a patrol car turn into his driveway.
Cops got out of the car, and I said, no, what's going on? That's all spousal abuse.
Eldon was flabbergasted. Shirley had called the cops and accused him of abusing her.
I said, well, what do you mean? I said, I've never raised a hand to her. Well, what she did, it looked like she took an earring or something like that, and she put a little scratch on her forearm.
Shirley's act was convincing. The officers put Eldon under arrest.
I said, for what? I said, I did nothing. I said, other than we've been arguing.
Police hauled a confused Eldon away to the local jail. Once there, they allowed him one phone call.
About 11 o'clock at night, my dad called me from Gloucester County Jail. Said that Shirley had him arrested. I asked him what for. He said she had him arrested on spousal abuse charges. I just knew he hadn't done anything to her.
Josh immediately posted bail, and the police let Eldon go. But they also slapped him with a restraining order.
They wouldn't let him go back to the house without an escort. So we met a couple of police officers. They followed us to the house. He got 15 minutes to go in, get his stuff, which was as much as he could grab, which at the time wasn't nothing but clothes. After we got all my dad's stuff, we stopped by the bank. So my dad gets some money out of the ATM.
And that's when Eldon's awful evening got even worse. He should have had more than $1,000 in the bank, but the money was gone.
Well, I had 78 cents in the bank, and I didn't know what was going on there. I said, I know there's got to be money there.
Confused and exhausted, Eldon called it a night. With nowhere else to go, he temporarily moved in with his son.
After a couple of days, I went to the credit union to find out why I didn't have no money.
And that's when Eldon found out just how devious Shirley had been.
They pull up my account, and then they pull up her account. The day before she arrested me, she went down and withdrew all the money except for 78 cents and transferred it from my account to her account. I said, well, that was pretty slick,
Several days later, Eldon went to court to answer for Shirley's charges of abuse. Despite his claims of innocence, the judge issued a 2-year protective order against him.
He wasn't to be within a certain distance of her or the property, which was his house, which was his property.
I wasn't allowed back in my own house that I purchased before I put her name on anything. I said, well, Your Honor, if you're going to do that, I said, you might well just go ahead and make it a lifetime because I'm filing for divorce as soon as we walk out of here.
But leaving Shirley would not be easy. Eldon would soon realize he had completely underestimated his sweet little wife.
Your trying to hide. You don't have enough manhood in you, you low-life piece of nothing.
By late 2005, Eldon Bowen had been through the ringer thanks to his scheming wife, Shirley.
She got control of the house, she got control of the checking account, she got control of the money. I trusted her and I loved her. You know, that was, I guess, my downfall.
By now, Eldon was living with his son and daughter-in-law after Shirley had kicked him out of his own home.
That really put a load on him. He was constantly telling Josh and I, I'm sorry I have to stay here. I'm sorry I have to depend on you. It was like shell shock for him.
Eldon was more than ready for a divorce, but the state of Virginia required a 12-month separation first. So while Eldon tried to get on with his life, Shirley seemed determined not to let him.
She would ride by the house at all hours of the night. We'd see her riding by.
She started ringing the phone constantly, up to 20 times a day. She would just ring the phone, ring the phone, ring the phone.
She tried to have 20 pizzas delivered to my house.
She was, just all these things to just poke. Yes, I'm here, I'm not leaving you alone.
First saved message.
She would call my dad knowing that she had a protection order against him.
Eldon, I'm trying to find out where you are. I don't know why we can't at least talk.
One time, he answered the phone, talked to her for a couple of minutes. She filed a charge against him for breaking the protection order when she called him.
Received October 18th. You're trying to hide. You're so damn by your family that you're afraid to even let them know that you care for your own wife.
I got stressed out. I think that's what she was trying to do. I think she was trying to really stress me out. I've never been one to worry about small stuff, but it took its toll on me.
You don't have enough manhood in you, you low-life piece of nothing.
Eldon did his best to ignore Shirley's bizarre behavior, but Shirley couldn't leave well enough alone. That spring, she made a devastating move.
A friend that introduced Shirley and I called me and told me that Shirley was getting rid of my stuff.
Everything he owned was in the house, and she had the protection order against him to where he couldn't be on that property.
All my possessions that I had, either she sold or she gave away. My boat's gone, my ATV's gone, all my tools. It was the most empty feeling I've ever had in my life because, you get the shirt on your back and that's it. Everything's gone. I didn't even get a spoon.
The stress got the better of Eldon. He suffered a heart attack and lost his job.
That's when I started really getting depressed. And I've never been depressed my whole life. I had no idea Shirley was going to put me through what she did.
Finally, in May of 2006, after a year of separation, Eldon was able to file for divorce. But he never expected Shirley's reaction.
She just wouldn't sign any divorce papers. They had a deputy take them to her. She wouldn't sign them. They had the court subpoena her. She wouldn't sign them.
I said, okay, well, if that's the way it's going to be, we've been separated, going on a year now. Eventually, she might find somebody she wants to get serious with again, and she'll sign my divorce papers.
As difficult as it was, Eldon tried to put the whole miserable experience behind him.
That's when I just let everything go. I was ready to go on about my way and just rebuild my life again.
But a year later, disturbing rumors began swirling around town, and Eldon and his family realized their ordeal was far from over.
We heard that she was out with this other guy dancing, and she was talking about she was going to get married again. So we decided to just kind of start looking at public court records and found out she had gotten married again and was in the process of trying to get a divorce.
Josh was shocked. Shirley had remarried while she was still legally married to Eldon.
I said, what in the world's going on here, you know? I said, I want my divorce first.
At his wit's end, Eldon went to see a detective.
I said, she never signed my divorce papers. I said, now what would that be? I said, wouldn't that be bigamy if she got remarried?
The detective pulled up Shirley's record and quickly realized this was much more than just a simple case of bigamy.
I wondered how she was keeping it all secret.
It seemed there was much more to this little old lady than anyone could have imagined.
There was investigations into bigamy, perjury, and financial crimes. Shirley seems to have perfected her scam over the years.
If you have a story of marriage gone wrong and would like to appear on this series, go to investigation.discovery.com. By the winter of 2007, it was becoming clear that Shirley Cassara was not at all who she seemed.
Shirley looked like a very sweet, older lady. She sure did. But her looks were definitely deceiving.
Investigators discovered that Shirley's past was littered with a string of husbands, some of them overlapping.
I found out, you know, that she was still married when we got married. And I found out that she had remarried after me, divorced him, and then got remarried again.
My dad thought she had only been married like 4 times. That's what was on their marriage certificate, but we find out that it's been actually 10 times she was married.
Eldon had been Shirley's 8th husband, not her 4th as she'd claimed.
I felt then that this was a game that she was playing. It made me right disturbed.
But that wasn't all. When investigators interviewed Shirley's 10th husband, his tale sounded eerily familiar.
Prior to this, he'd been married for 32 years. His wife passed away. And he was lonely, and he met Shirley online. Once they were married, within 4 days, she was already calling the sheriff's office here in Gloucester and reporting that he is assaulting her.
While husband number 10 was in jail, Shirley wiped out his bank account. And husband number 7 claims the same thing happened to him, too.
Shirley found gentlemen, started dating them, and eventually marrying them. Once they were married is when her attitude would change, and that's when the allegations of domestic violence would start. The husbands would be arrested. Protective orders would be obtained. She managed to get her name put on properties, onto bank accounts, and she would completely clean them all out.
By 2010, after a 2-year investigation, detectives in 3 different counties had assembled a thick file on Shirley. Her crimes ran the gamut: embezzlement, bigamy, and fraud.
Shirley was somebody you look at and think grandma. It was very shocking.
Shirley was arrested on July 15th, 2010.
Made me feel good. It really made me feel good. What she done, she put me in such a bind. You know, after losing my job, losing my house, getting stressed out, going half crazy. You know, what she did was wrong.
In April 2011, after a trial that was the talk of the town,
That is the meanest little woman that I have ever encountered in my life.
Shirley was sentenced to 1 year in jail for bigamy. In July of that same year, she was sentenced to another year for embezzlement. She became known as the gold-digging grandma in the local community.
I don't think Shirley could love anybody but herself. Her only equal in life was when she looked in the mirror. Everybody else, he was just an object.
Today, Eldon lives in a small apartment close to his son, daughter-in-law, and his beloved grandkids. He has plans to file a civil suit against Shirley in the future and hopes to recoup some of what he lost.
I may never get it all back, but it will be nice to get some, if not most of it back.
He's also taken on another mission: to warn unsuspecting men about Shirley's schemes.
As far as Shirley goes,
humid expanse of Houston, Texas, at the dawn of the 1970s, the concept of neighborhood safety was a deeply ingrained facet of the American suburban ideal. It was an era characterized by a profound, albeit fragile, sense of communal trust. Neighborhoods like the Heights were places where children and teenagers roamed freely, riding bicycles under the searing Texas sun until the streetlights flickered on, signaling the time to return to the sanctuary of their homes. It was a time before the advent of constant digital surveillance, a time when parents implicitly trusted the familiar faces that populated their daily lives. The local shopkeepers, the neighbors down the street, and the friendly figures within the community were viewed not with suspicion, but with a warm, unquestioning familiarity. Yet, it is precisely within this seemingly idyllic and unguarded setting that one of the most profound, devastating, and sinister betrayals of communal trust in American history began to silently unfold. The tragedy that would eventually consume the Houston area was not a sudden, explosive act of violence, but rather a slow, methodical, and invisible erosion of a community's youth, orchestrated by a man who hid his unimaginable darkness behind a mask of everyday benevolence. The figure at the center of this unprecedented nightmare did not fit the traditional archetype of a lurking monster. He did not hide in the desolate outskirts of town or wait in the pitch-black shadows of abandoned alleys to ambush unsuspecting strangers. Instead, Dean Corll weaponized the light of day and the facade of generous kindness. To the local children and the struggling youth of the area, he was a smiling, approachable presence. He earned a moniker that sounds almost entirely like a character pulled from the brightly colored pages of an innocent children's storybook, a title meant to evoke joy, comfort, and sweet indulgence. They called him the Candyman. This nickname was not a cruel irony bestowed upon him after his crimes were uncovered, but a reflection of his actual, daily behavior. Corll managed a local candy factory and frequently handed out free sweets to the neighborhood children, establishing himself as a generous benefactor in a world where free treats were a universal language of childhood trust. The giving of candy is perhaps the most fundamental gesture of goodwill one can extend to a child, and Corll used this exact gesture to systematically disarm the innate defensive instincts of the vulnerable youth surrounding him. The psychological horror of Dean Corll lies in this catastrophic subversion of trust. He was not a stranger. He was a fixture. He embedded himself into the social fabric of the community, offering a warm smile and a handful of sugar to mask a mind entirely consumed by predatory desires. When we examine the annals of true crime, there is a distinct and terrifying category reserved for those who use their perceived goodness as a hunting mechanism. Corll mastered this dark art. He understood that violence is most effectively perpetrated not through sheer force, but through the careful, patient cultivation of vulnerability. By offering free candy, he did not just attract children. He conditioned them and their parents to view him as harmless, effectively creating a blind spot in the community's collective peripheral vision. This weaponized kindness allowed him to operate with absolute impunity, constructing a sprawling network of horror right beneath the noses of a trusting society. Between the years 1970 and 1973, a terrifying and completely silent epidemic plagued the Houston area. It was not a conventional disease that took the youth, but a systematic, calculated eradication of human life. Over this 3-year period, young men and teenage boys simply began to vanish. They would leave their homes to walk to a friend's house, or ride their bikes to the local store, and they would never return. There were no immediate crime scenes, no signs of a struggle left on the sidewalks, and no ransoms demanded. The disappearances were clean, quiet, and profoundly absolute. The slow bleeding of the community went largely unnoticed by the broader public for an agonizing amount of time. 28 young men and teenage boys. That is the official number, a staggering, incomprehensible tally of human lives extinguished before they had the chance to truly begin. To merely state the number is to do a grave disservice to the magnitude of the tragedy. 28 represents 28 empty bedrooms, 28 untouched dinner plates, and 28 families plunged into a purgatory of unending, unanswered questions. The pain of a sudden loss is devastating, but the agony of a disappearance is a unique form of psychological torture. For the mothers, fathers, and siblings left behind, every knock at the door, Every ring of the telephone and every unfamiliar car turning down the street carried a suffocating weight of desperate hope and paralyzing fear. The families of these boys were forced to live in a suspended state of grief, unable to mourn and unable to move forward, completely unaware that their loved ones had fallen prey to a man who had freely handed them candy on a sunny afternoon. Historically, the gravity of the Dean Corll case is monumental. Before the world had ever heard the name of John Wayne Gacy, and before the horrifying discovery of the bodies buried beneath the crawlspace of that infamous Chicago home, Dean Corll had already established a horrific blueprint for large-scale domestic terror. Prior to the unearthing of the mass graves in Texas, the concept of a serial killer operating with such prolific and unchecked brutality over an extended period of time was almost entirely alien to the American public consciousness. The revelation of the Houston mass murders served as a brutal awakening, shattering the fragile illusion of suburban safety and forcing the nation to confront the terrifying reality that the most profound evil does not always announce itself with a menacing scowl, but often approaches with an outstretched hand and a friendly demeanor. Corll set a dark, grim milestone in the history of crime, establishing a threshold of malevolence that remains deeply disturbing to this very day. Yet, perhaps the most agonizing and frustrating element of this entire dark chapter is not just the cunning nature of the predator, but the systemic failures that allowed him to continue his hunt uninterrupted for 3 long years. The silence that surrounded the disappearance of these 28 boys was not merely a result of Corll hiding his tracks well, it was heavily compounded by an institutional refusal to listen. As the frantic families of the missing youth approached the authorities, clutching photographs of their sons and pleading for assistance, they were met with a wall of bureaucratic indifference. The local police forces, operating under the social prejudices and rigid protocols of the era, consistently failed to recognize the sinister pattern unfolding right in front of them. Instead of launching comprehensive investigations into the vanishing teenagers, the authorities summarily dismissed the missing youth, categorically labeling them as mere runaways. This tragic misclassification was a fatal error that provided Dean Corll with the ultimate cover. By officially declaring that these boys had simply chosen to leave home, the police effectively closed the door on any proactive search efforts. They rationalized the disappearances by pointing to the rebellious nature of the 1970s youth culture, assuming that these teenagers had simply drifted away to join counterculture movements or escape strict households. This assumption, deeply rooted in a lack of empathy and a failure of investigative imagination, left the most vulnerable members of society completely unprotected. The families were left entirely alone in their frantic searches, posting homemade flyers on telephone poles and wandering the streets, completely abandoned by the very institutions designed to protect them. The failure of the authorities to look beyond the surface level of these disappearances is a haunting reminder of how societal blind spots and institutional apathy can become unwitting accomplices to the most heinous of crimes. This narrative we are about to explore is not a celebration of a criminal mastermind, nor is it an attempt to romanticize the dark, twisted deeds of a serial killer. The true crime genre often runs the perilous risk of elevating the perpetrator to a status of twisted mythology, focusing intensely on the macabre details while the victims fade into the background as mere footnotes in their own tragic stories. That will not be the approach here. This deep dive into the Houston mass murders is fundamentally a solemn, unflinching examination of a profound tragedy. It is a necessary confrontation with a dark historical reality, driven by a deep commitment to empathy and a responsibility to bear witness to the suffering of the innocent. Our focus must remain steadfastly anchored to the humanity of the 28 young souls who were so violently robbed of their futures. We must strive to understand the environment that failed them, the mechanisms of the trap they walked into, and the ultimate, chaotic unraveling of the monster who took them. As we prepare to step back into the oppressive heat of Houston in the early 70s, we must brace ourselves to look directly into a darkness that defies basic human comprehension. We will dissect the insidious methods used to lure these boys, the horrifying reality of what awaited them behind closed doors, and the eventual, explosive night that brought the reign of the Candyman to a bloody, violent halt. It is a journey into the deepest shadows of human nature, a story of profound loss, unimaginable betrayal, and a delayed, imperfect justice that emerged only after a sea of innocent blood had already been spilled on the Texas soil. The landscape of Houston and its surrounding areas, particularly neighborhoods like the Heights during the early 1970s, provided a seemingly idyllic backdrop that tragically masked a growing, unseen horror. To understand the magnitude of the devastation wrought by Dean Corll, one must first look at the faces of those he targeted. The victims were not wealthy socialites or high-profile individuals whose sudden absence would immediately trigger a massive, citywide mobilization of law enforcement and media attention. They were everyday youth, ranging in age from 13 to their early 20s. They were the boys who rode their bicycles down dusty streets, the teenagers who lingered outside local convenience stores, and the young men trying to navigate the complex transition from adolescence into adulthood. Some were from stable, loving homes, completely embedded in the fabric of their local communities, while others were more transient, categorized by society as runaways or drifters searching for a place to belong. This diversity in their backgrounds was unified by a single, tragic commonality, which was their inherent vulnerability. They were at an age where the desire for independence, peer acceptance, and a sense of adventure often overrides the natural instincts of caution and self-preservation. Corll recognized this universal teenage condition not with the protective eye of a guardian, but with the calculated, predatory gaze of a hunter assessing his prey. However, Dean Corll understood that a man of his age randomly approaching teenage boys on the street might eventually raise suspicions, even in an era of profound communal trust. To build an efficient and completely inconspicuous pipeline of victims, he needed a bridge to the youth culture of Houston. He found this bridge by enlisting the help of two local teenagers, David Brooks and Elmer Wayne Henley. The involvement of Brooks and Henley represents one of the most chilling and deeply disturbing aspects of this entire criminal enterprise. These were not hardened, adult criminals from the criminal underworld. They were peers of the victims. They were classmates, neighbors, and in many heartbreaking instances, they were considered actual friends by the boys they would eventually lead to their deaths. Corll manipulated these two teenagers, exploiting their own vulnerabilities, their desire for material wealth, and perhaps a darker, latent sociopathy that he managed to awaken and nurture. He transformed them from ordinary adolescents into active, willing facilitators of a mass murder operation. The mechanics of this partnership were entirely transactional, reducing human life to a fixed, horrifyingly low monetary value. Corll paid Brooks and Henley exactly $200 for every single victim they successfully lured back to his residence. This bounty system incentivized the accomplices to continuously scour their own social circles, looking for anyone who might be easily persuaded to join them for a seemingly innocent hangout. The profound betrayal of trust here is almost impossible to fully comprehend. The victims did not walk into the home of a dangerous, unknown predator. They followed people they knew. They followed familiar faces who offered them a ride, a place to relax, or the promise of a good time away from the prying eyes of parents and authority figures. Brooks and Henley weaponized their own youth and their social standing to completely disarm the natural defenses of their peers. When a friend invites you over to hang out, the primitive alarm bells that warn of danger remain completely silent. The victims walked through the front door of Corll's residence with smiles on their faces, completely unaware that they had just crossed the threshold into a carefully constructed slaughterhouse. Once inside the residence, the atmosphere was deliberately designed to maintain the illusion of a relaxed, welcoming environment. Corll played the role of the generous, laid-back older host. The environment was carefully curated to appeal to teenagers, offering a safe haven where the strict rules of the outside world did not apply. To further lower their inhibitions and completely neutralize any potential physical resistance, the victims were encouraged to partake in intoxicants. Corll and his accomplices freely provided alcohol and facilitated the inhalation of toxic fumes, specifically glue or acrylic paint, a practice prevalent among rebellious youth at the time. The victims, believing they were simply engaging in illicit teenage rebellion in a safe space, willingly consumed these substances. The alcohol and the chemical fumes slowly began to cloud their judgment, impair their motor skills, and dull their senses. The predator and his accomplices watched patiently as the drugs took effect, waiting for the precise moment when the victim was too incapacitated to fight back, too confused to understand the shifting dynamics of the room, and too weak to flee. The transition from a friendly gathering to an absolute nightmare was terrifyingly swift and brutally efficient. As the intoxicating effects of the alcohol and glue reached their peak, the illusion of safety was violently shattered. The victims, now sluggish and disoriented, suddenly found themselves overpowered. The true, horrifying nature of Dean Corll was finally revealed, completely devoid of the friendly demeanor he used to mask his darkness. The victims were violently stripped of their clothing, a process designed not just for physical control, but for ultimate psychological humiliation and degradation. They were forced from the comfortable illusion of a living room party into the hidden, terrifying reality of Corll's inner sanctum. It was here that the victims encountered the central, physical manifestation of the killer's depravity, a massive, custom-made wooden structure specifically designed for human suffering. This structure was a torture board, a large piece of thick plywood meticulously constructed and equipped with restraints by Corll himself. This board was not an improvised tool. It was a deliberate, engineered platform for violence, revealing the deep premeditation and the organized, ritualistic nature of his crimes. The incapacitated victims were dragged to this board and ruthlessly bound to it. Their wrists and ankles were securely fastened, spreading their limbs and rendering them completely immobile and utterly defenseless. The sheer terror of waking from a drug-induced haze to find oneself naked, restrained to a wooden board, and completely at the mercy of a sadistic predator is a level of psychological agony that defies adequate description. The victims were entirely trapped, isolated from the world they knew, and imprisoned within a soundproofed nightmare where their screams would never be heard by anyone who could help them. Bound to the board, the young men and boys were subjected to the full, unrestrained horror of Dean Corll's violent compulsions. The data strictly outlines a pattern of severe sexual violence and unimaginable physical torture. Corll utilized his complete physical dominance over the restrained victims to inflict prolonged suffering. The specifics of these acts, while deeply disturbing, are vital to understanding the absolute ruthlessness of the perpetrator and the immense suffering endured by the victims. They were not simply killed, they were destroyed, both physically and psychologically, over a period of time. The agonizing reality is that these boys, who had walked into the house expecting camaraderie and a brief escape from their daily lives, spent their final hours enduring unspeakable pain and profound terror. They were forced to look into the eyes of the man who had ordered their suffering, and perhaps even more devastatingly, into the eyes of the peers who had sold their lives for a mere $200. The final act of this gruesome ritual was always death, brought about through cold, calculated means. After Corll had exhausted his desire for torture and sexual violence, he ended the lives of his victims. The methods of execution were as brutal as the torture that preceded them. He most frequently used a nylon cord, wrapping it tightly around the necks of the restrained boys and slowly, methodically strangling the remaining life out of them. The use of a nylon cord is a deeply intimate and violent method of murder, requiring the killer to remain physically connected to the victim as they struggle for their final breaths. In other instances, when strangulation was not the chosen method, Corll utilized a .22 caliber pistol. He would shoot the victims, ending their suffering with a sudden, final act of ballistic violence. Whether by the slow, agonizing restriction of air through a nylon cord or the abrupt, piercing trauma of a .22 caliber bullet, the result was the same. A young life, full of unwritten potential and future possibilities, was violently extinguished on a wooden board in a quiet Texas neighborhood. The aftermath of each murder was handled with the same cold, logistical efficiency that characterized the luring process. The bodies were removed from the torture board, and the physical evidence of the horrific acts was meticulously cleaned away, preparing the room for the next inevitable victim. Corll, Brooks, and Henley functioned as a macabre assembly line of death, completely detached from the humanity of the boys they were slaughtering. They operated under the arrogant assumption that their actions would remain forever hidden, shielded by the societal apathy that quickly labeled the missing youth as mere runaways. They believed they had created a perfect, impenetrable system of abduction, torture, and murder. As the bodies began to accumulate, secretly transported to various hidden locations, the city of Houston remained blissfully unaware of the monster residing within its borders. The families of the victims continued to wait by their windows, holding on to fading hopes, completely oblivious to the fact that their sons, brothers, and friends had fallen victim to a carefully orchestrated trap, betrayed by their peers, and sacrificed on a wooden altar of unimaginable cruelty. The silence of the authorities and the quiet efficiency of the killers allowed this dark operation to continue completely unchecked, setting the stage for a prolonged period of undetected slaughter that would eventually require a violent, internal collapse to finally bring it to light. The unchecked proliferation of these crimes was fueled by a systemic institutional apathy that prioritized convenience over the lives of the marginalized youth. Throughout the years between 1970 and 1973, the Houston Police Department operated with a profound and dangerous lack of curiosity regarding the growing number of missing persons reports originating from the Heights and surrounding areas. When parents approached the station, trembling with anxiety and clutching the photographs of their sons, the response they received was rarely one of urgent investigation. Instead, they were greeted by the bureaucratic machinery of dismissal. Because many of the victims were teenagers, and because some originated from lower-income backgrounds or had histories of restlessness, the authorities defaulted to the convenient classification of these cases as runaways. This label functioned as a psychological barrier for the investigators, absolving them of the necessity to treat these disappearances as potential criminal matters. It was an era where the social expectation was that teenagers would occasionally vanish, seeking a life beyond the domestic sphere, and the police department leaned heavily into this narrative to avoid the arduous labor of tracking down missing boys who were theoretically exercising their own agency. This institutional failure created a vacuum of accountability that Dean Corll exploited with ruthless precision. The families, desperate for answers, were left to navigate a labyrinth of neglect. They were told to wait, to hope, and to accept the silence of their missing children as a common fact of life in an urban environment. They were never given the assurance that their loved ones were the subject of a serious, coordinated effort by law enforcement. The police did not connect the individual cases, failing to observe the spatial or demographic patterns that linked the disappearances. Each report was treated as an isolated incident, a singular occurrence that held no larger implication for public safety. This was not merely a lapse in professional judgment. It was a fundamental failure of public service that effectively abandoned these families to their own devices. While the parents scoured the streets, organized search parties on their own, and lived in the agonizing limbo of unanswered questions, Corll continued his work, emboldened by the realization that no one was truly looking for the boys he took. The tragedy of the situation was compounded by the fact that the victims were not merely vanishing into thin air, they were being systematically erased from existence. Corll, Brooks, and Henley acted with a level of cold, methodical care that minimized the chances of accidental discovery. They were not panicked killers driven by impulsive rage in every encounter. They were predators who understood the necessity of silence. They understood that as long as the bodies remained undiscovered and the disappearances remained categorized as runaways, they were untouchable. The police had no reason to patrol the areas where Corll frequented because they had no reason to believe a killer was active. The parents, meanwhile, were misled by the very officials they relied upon for protection, directed away from the truth by the dismissive attitude of the state. This period of stagnation was not a lack of evidence, but a lack of will, a refusal to see the darkness that was hiding in plain sight. The narrative of these years is one of profound, agonizing silence. It was a silence filled by the suffering of the victims, the predatory confidence of Corll, and the tragic resignation of the families. There were no sirens to mark the disappearances, no headlines to announce the deaths, and no public alarm to alert the neighborhood. The horror unfolded in a series of quiet, intimate moments of betrayal that culminated in the cold stillness of the grave. Every day that the authorities failed to act was another day that Coral was given the opportunity to continue his cycle of violence. Every boy he targeted was someone's son, someone's brother, someone's friend, yet they were discarded by the system with a casualness that is, in retrospect, as haunting as the crimes themselves. The institutional failure was not just an obstacle to justice, it was a catalyst for further slaughter, allowing the Candyman to operate for 3 years without ever facing the scrutiny that would have undoubtedly exposed him. During these years, the psychological impact on the community was slow, insidious, and devastating. The disappearance of one boy might be an anomaly, but the disappearance of many creates a pervasive atmosphere of unease, a gnawing, unspoken fear that something is fundamentally wrong. Families began to watch their children more closely, not out of any specific knowledge of the threat, but out of a primal instinct that the world around them had become dangerous. Yet, without the confirmation or the leadership of law enforcement to guide them, this unease remained unfocused and ineffective. The police continued to tell them that their children would return, that they were simply experimenting with independence, effectively gaslighting the community into believing that their concerns were unfounded. This delay in acknowledging the existence of a predator allowed Coral to perfect his methods, to recruit his accomplices, and to solidify his infrastructure of death. He was allowed to grow in power and audacity, unchecked by the institutions that stood as the only barrier between him and the youth he targeted. As we look back at this period, it is essential to recognize that the responsibility for these deaths does not lie solely with the hands that committed the violence. It lies also with the systemic refusal to protect the vulnerable. The police culture of the early 70s in Houston, characterized by a hardened, dismissive approach to marginalized demographics, created the environment in which Dean Coral could thrive. They were not merely indifferent, they were complicit through their silence. When the parents of the missing cried out for help, they were effectively silenced by the authority of the badge, told that their intuition was wrong and their children were fine. This dynamic is a core element of the tragedy, highlighting the critical importance of listening to the voices of those who suffer, rather than dismissing them based on preconceived notions of who is worthy of a thorough investigation. The culmination of this long, dark period would not come through police ingenuity or forensic advancement, but through a collapse of the structure from within. The weight of the secret, the pressure of the crimes, and the volatile nature of the killers would eventually create the circumstances for the end of the operation. The complacency of the authorities meant that justice would only be served when the predators themselves forced the issue, when the internal friction of their arrangement made it impossible to maintain the facade of safety. For 3 years, they played with the lives of others as if they were pawns in a game, never suspecting that the end would come from the very tools they used to facilitate their carnage. The story of those 3 years is a testament to the fact that evil, when left unchecked, does not simply fade away. It deepens, it spreads, and it creates a legacy of pain that persists long after the crimes themselves have been exposed. The silence that enabled these murders is a permanent stain on the record of the Houston authorities, a stark warning of the consequences of institutional apathy and the vital necessity of vigilance in the face of unexplained disappearances. The victims, whose lives were sacrificed for nothing more than the twisted pleasure of a monster, deserve to be remembered not as runaway teenagers, but as human beings who were stolen by an evil that the system refused to acknowledge until it was far, far too late. Their memory is the weight that balances the scales, a persistent demand for a reality where such institutional failure is no longer possible. The night of August 8, 1973, stands as the violent, chaotic threshold that finally shattered the impenetrable silence surrounding the Houston mass murders. It was a culmination of 3 years of accumulated evil, a night where the internal dynamics of the predatory trio shifted from cold, calculated cooperation to a raw, primal struggle for survival. For Dean Coral, the night was supposed to be another iteration of his dark ritual, but it was doomed from the beginning by his own volatile temper and the unpredictable nature of his accomplices. Elmer Wayne Henley, tasked with his usual duty of luring unsuspecting targets to the house, had brought along 2 individuals, a young man named Timothy Curley and a teenage girl named Rhonda Williams. This decision was a fundamental violation of the rigid, twisted code that Coral had established for his operations. Coral viewed his predatory acts as a highly specialized, exclusive ritual focused solely on young men, and the introduction of a female into this environment served as an immediate, explosive trigger for his rage. The presence of Rhonda Williams disrupted the singular focus of his perversion, and in the heightened, intoxicated state of the house, it ignited a confrontation that would irrevocably alter the course of their lives and end the reign of the Candyman forever. The atmosphere in the residence, already heavy with the fumes of glue and the suffocating tension of the activities being conducted, became a crucible of lethal pressure. Coral, blinded by his anger at Henley's deviation from his rules, abandoned all semblance of his friendly, benefactor persona. As the evening progressed and the intoxicants took their toll, rendering Henley and the newcomers into a state of deep, sluggish disorientation, Coral began his final act of control. He systematically bound his victims, including his own accomplice, to the very torture board that had served as the altar for his past atrocities. He secured Timothy Curley, Rhonda Williams, and Elmer Wayne Henley, effectively stripping them of their autonomy and placing them squarely under his absolute, violent power. This act of lashing out at his own partner was the ultimate expression of Coral's narcissism and his belief in his own total dominance. He had decided that they were all expendable, that the secrets they held were no longer safe, and that the time had come to purge his own circle of those who had become liabilities. For Henley, waking up to the reality of his own imminent death was the final, brutal realization of the environment he had helped build. As the fog of the intoxicants lifted just enough for Henley to comprehend the gravity of his situation, he faced a terrifying, existential choice. He was strapped to the same board, facing the same lethal fate as the victims he had helped lure to this place. He recognized that Coral was not merely angry but was actively preparing to dispose of them all, that the rules of their arrangement had been incinerated in the furnace of the killer's insanity. In a desperate, split-second decision driven by the primal instinct for self-preservation, Henley initiated a psychological gamble of impossible stakes. He began to plead with Coral, not for mercy, but for a chance to demonstrate his loyalty and his willingness to participate in the final, ultimate act of the night. He presented a chilling offer. If Coral would release him, he would take responsibility for the death of the other two victims, effectively proving that he was still the obedient tool that Coral had molded him to be. It was a masterful, albeit horrific, manipulation, an attempt to use the very psychology that Coral had employed to recruit him as a shield against the blades and ropes of the torture room. Coral, blinded by his own arrogance and his belief that he had successfully broken the spirit of his accomplice, accepted the premise of the deal. He untied Henley, and in a final, fatal error of judgment, he placed the power of life and death directly into the hands of the very person he had just threatened to murder. He handed Henley a .22 caliber pistol, the same tool he used to extinguish the lives of his previous victims, and instructed him to proceed with the execution of Curley and Williams. In that moment, the power dynamic in the room underwent a total, irreversible shift. Henley stood with the weapon in his hand, looking at the man who had orchestrated the nightmare of the last 3 years, and recognized that the moment of his own death was only a heartbeat away if he hesitated. The room was deathly quiet, the air thick with the smell of chemicals and the weight of the impending violence. Henley realized that there was no going back, that the path of the accomplice had reached its end, and that the only way to leave the room alive was to turn the weapon on the architect of the slaughter. With the pistol gripped firmly in his hand, Henley moved with a sudden, decisive burst of action that caught Coral entirely off guard. The cycle of the Candyman's violence was interrupted by the very instrument he used to perpetuate it. Henley fired the gun, not at the intended victims on the board, but at the chest and shoulders of Dean Coral. The shots rang out in rapid, deafening succession, filling the small space with the smell of gunpowder and the sudden, jarring shock of the encounter. 6 times the trigger was pulled, each shot a final, desperate protest against the terror that Coral had imposed upon them. The bullets hit their target, forcing the predator back, shattering the illusion of his invincibility, and permanently ending the reign of the man who had terrorized the youth of Houston. Coral collapsed to the ground, his life rapidly draining away as the consequences of his own brutality finally caught up to him. The monster was dead, not by the hand of the law or the investigative efforts of the police, but by the hands of the very person he had tried to consume. In the immediate, stunned aftermath of the shooting, the reality of the situation began to settle over the room. The silence that followed was different from the silence that had preceded it. It was the heavy, suffocating silence of total collapse. Henley, his hands trembling and his mind racing with the implications of what he had done, was forced to confront the wreckage of the life he had led for the past 3 years. He had effectively ended the killings, but he had done so from a position of absolute complicity. The fear that had driven him to kill his mentor was now replaced by the terrifying realization that the authorities would soon be coming for him, not as a hero who had stopped a killer, but as a primary participant in the most prolific series of murders in the history of the region. He had survived the night, but he had lost his future in the process. The act of self-preservation that had saved him from the torture board had also tethered him permanently to the crimes of the man lying dead on the floor. This pivotal night serves as the crucial turning point in the investigation, the moment when the hidden darkness was dragged into the light, not through the systematic application of justice, but through the internal explosion of a criminal structure. It was a chaotic, unplanned conclusion to an ordeal that had devastated dozens of families. The police, who had failed to see the warning signs for 3 years, were about to be confronted with a reality so immense and so horrific that it would force a total reevaluation of their investigative failures. The death of Dean Coral was the beginning of the end of the secret, the start of a process that would reveal the true cost of the apathy that had allowed the Candyman to roam free for so long. As the night turned toward morning, the full scope of the tragedy was poised to emerge, beginning with the confession of a broken, frightened, and complicit teenager who had, in a final moment of terror, decided that he could no longer bear the weight of the secret he had shared with the monster. The night of August 8, 1973, was not merely a moment of violence. It was the moment the facade of the suburban Houston ideal was permanently destroyed, leaving behind a legacy of trauma that would echo through the lives of the survivors and the families of the victims for the rest of their lives. Following the violent, internal collapse of the criminal trio on that fateful night in August of 1973, the subsequent revelation of the sheer scale of the atrocity transformed the atmosphere of Houston from a quiet, trusting community into an epicenter of national shock and horror. Elmer Wayne Henley, in a state of profound psychological disintegration, contacted the authorities, initiating a process of self-incrimination that would eventually lead investigators into the darkest corners of the city. The initial disclosure by Henley was met with a mixture of disbelief and, as the magnitude of his claims began to materialize, a growing sense of panic within the investigative ranks. For the families who had spent years searching for their missing sons, the information provided by Henley and the subsequent cooperation of David Brooks served as the brutal, final resolution to their long, agonizing wait in the dark. The process of searching for the victims was not a mere forensic investigation. It was a grueling, emotional, and physical excavation of a landscape defined by the secrets of a serial killer. The investigation began in earnest as authorities descended upon a rented boat shed in southwest Houston, a location that had been identified by the accomplices as a primary burial site. What they uncovered within the confines of that nondescript structure was a scene of such systemic, industrial-scale carnage that it defied any conventional expectation of criminal behavior. Beneath the floorboards of the facility, investigators discovered the remains of 17 young men. The victims had been buried in a manner that evidenced a chillingly high degree of organization and cold, calculated detachment. Each body had been covered in a thick layer of quicklime and protected by plastic tarpaulins, a measure clearly designed to accelerate decomposition and effectively mask the odor of putrefaction from any casual passersby. This discovery was the first definitive confirmation of the monstrous reality that had been unfolding undetected in the heart of the community. It rendered the previous institutional failure of the police force utterly undeniable, as the reality of the 28 known victims far exceeded even the most pessimistic projections of the families who had long insisted on the existence of a coordinated threat. The search expanded rapidly beyond the confines of the boat shed, moving into the natural landscapes of East Texas that Quarles and his accomplices had utilized to dispose of the victims they could not conceal within the walls of their structures. The High Island Beach area, a desolate stretch of coastline, became the site of a grim and painstaking search as investigators carefully sifted through the sand in a desperate bid to locate the remains of those who had been discarded like refuse. 4 additional bodies were recovered from shallow, makeshift graves along the coastline, each representing another life lost to the same cycle of abduction and execution. The recovery process was a profound, multi-layered trauma for the families involved, as the realization that their loved ones had been treated with such profound disrespect in their final moments added a new, agonizing dimension to their grief. The search moved from the coast to the Sam Rayburn Reservoir, where the deep waters and the surrounding wilderness held yet more of the victims of the Houston mass murders. The total number of confirmed victims eventually reached 28, though even as the investigation concluded, lingering doubts remained among the forensic teams that this number represented the absolute totality of the loss, as the passage of time and the nature of the burial sites suggested that other victims might have been lost to the elements entirely. The legal proceedings that followed the recovery of the bodies were focused on the accountability of those who had been the secondary, yet essential, participants in the operation. David Brooks, whose role as a primary recruiter and facilitator for the murders was extensive, was brought to justice in a series of legal battles that emphasized his culpability in the orchestration of the kidnappings. The prosecution, tasked with the immense burden of detailing the systematic nature of the crimes, painted a picture of a man who had traded his morality for financial reward and the gratification of his dark impulses. Brooks was eventually sentenced to life in prison, a verdict that provided a measure of legal closure, though it could never replace the lives that had been extinguished. He would remain behind bars for the duration of his life, ultimately passing away in the year 2020 due to complications from the global pandemic, a final, quiet end to a figure whose life had been inextricably linked to the most violent chapter of Houston history. His imprisonment, however, was merely one facet of a broader reckoning with the systemic and personal failures that had characterized the entire affair. Elmer Wayne Henley, the young man whose own hand had finally brought the killer to justice, faced a similarly rigorous legal process. Despite his role in stopping the carnage, his history of participation in the kidnappings, the recruitment of victims, and his active involvement in the environment of abuse rendered him a primary defendant in the eyes of the law. The courtroom testimony was an exhaustive, painful, and often harrowing experience, as the details of the torture board, the methods of strangulation, and the cold, transactional nature of the recruitment process were laid bare for the public record. The court, cognizant of the extraordinary and horrific nature of the crimes, handed down a sentence that reflected the gravity of his role. Henley was given 6 consecutive life sentences, a total of 594 years in prison. This sentence was a clear statement by the judicial system that while his final actions might have ended the murders, his complicity in the crimes remained a permanent, unforgivable stain that required the maximum possible punishment. The trial and sentencing of both Brooks and Henley served as a grim conclusion to the legal proceedings, yet the resolution of the trials did little to alleviate the pervasive sense of loss that continued to haunt the Houston area. The community was left to grapple with the aftermath of an investigation that had shattered their perception of safety and revealed the true cost of their own institutional apathy. The legal process was characterized by a meticulous documentation of the evidence, ensuring that every detail, from the logistics of the boat shed to the personal histories of the victims, was formally recorded. This was done not only to secure a conviction, but to provide an objective record of a horror that might otherwise have been forgotten or downplayed. The transcripts of these trials represent a comprehensive, if agonizing, history of the period, a source of information that future generations could turn to in order to understand the dangers of a society that refuses to acknowledge the reality of its own dangers. As the legal aftermath finally settled and the details were committed to the archive of criminal history, the focus for the families and the community shifted toward the long, arduous process of mourning. The recovery of the remains had allowed for proper burials, a small but significant comfort that had been denied to many during the years of uncertainty. The investigation, which had begun in the wake of a single act of desperate self-preservation, had spiraled into a national scandal that forced the authorities to confront their failure to act upon the repeated pleas of the families. The lessons learned during this dark period were stark and immutable: the necessity of vigilance, the danger of institutional bias, and the critical importance of hearing the voices of the vulnerable. The aftermath of the case remains a sobering reminder of the potential for profound tragedy when the structures of society fail to protect those they are sworn to serve. It stands as a testament to the fact that justice, when delayed, is fundamentally incomplete, and that the scars left behind by such horrors are etched deeply into the fabric of the community, serving as a permanent, silent warning against the recurrence of the apathy that allowed such an evil to flourish for so long in the quiet streets of Houston. The echoes of the Houston mass murders do not fade simply because the primary perpetrators were removed from society, nor do they diminish with the passage of decades. The legacy of Dean Corll and his accomplices resides in the enduring, profound grief of the families whose lives were permanently fractured by the loss of their children, and in the collective consciousness of a community that was forced to confront the fragility of its own perceived security. Reflecting on this tragedy requires a steadfast commitment to understanding its broader implications, not as a sensationalized tale of gore, but as a sobering study of the conditions that permit evil to take root and flourish. The most haunting aspect of the entire affair is the realization that the catastrophe was not inevitable. It was, in many significant ways, a preventable tragedy that was enabled by the profound failure of empathy and the systemic institutional blindness that categorized the disappearances of innocent youth as the mundane actions of runaway children. When we consider the broader societal lessons, it becomes clear that the primary catalyst for the extension of this horror was the dehumanization of the victims before they were even harmed. By labeling them as runaways, society effectively stripped them of their right to protection and their right to be missed with the urgency that their disappearances warranted. This societal negligence is a mirror reflecting the deeper prejudices and rigid social hierarchies of the 1970s, where the lives of teenagers from specific neighborhoods or backgrounds were not accorded the same value as others. The tragedy of the Houston mass murders is a stark testament to the dangerous consequences of indifference, reminding us that when we fail to see the intrinsic worth in every individual, we create the perfect environment for the predatory to operate with impunity. The victims were not merely statistics or casualties of a dark era. They were individuals with dreams, families, and futures that were systematically stolen, leaving behind a silence that, even today, demands to be heard and understood. The psychological impact on the survivors and the families of the victims was immense, creating a lasting trauma that rippled through the decades. For many parents, the discovery of the bodies was not the end of their suffering, but the beginning of a different kind of pain, one rooted in the knowledge of the horrific final moments that their children endured. The trauma of the unknown was replaced by the trauma of the certain, a burden that shifted the trajectory of their lives forever. Yet, in the face of such overwhelming loss, there were those who channeled their grief into a demand for institutional change, striving to ensure that no future families would be met with the same wall of indifference. Their voices serve as a vital, often overlooked component of the story, representing the resilience of the human spirit in the wake of unimaginable darkness. They remind us that behind every headline and every courtroom detail is a story of personal, irreplaceable human loss. The role of the accomplices, David Brooks and Elmer Wayne Henley, remains a subject of complex contemplation, as it forces us to grapple with the disturbing nature of complicity and the malleability of youth in the face of manipulation. How a peer can become a predator is a question that challenges our understanding of moral development and the influence of external forces on individual behavior. Their actions were not simply the result of a single moment of weakness. They were a sustained, deliberate participation in a cycle of violence that lasted for years. Their existence within the narrative of the crime underscores the danger of environments where the moral compass is entirely discarded in favor of material gain or the perverse allure of a charismatic, dangerous leader. This aspect of the case serves as a warning about the necessity of cultivating environments where youth are shielded from those who would exploit their vulnerabilities for the most heinous of purposes. Furthermore, the legal and investigative legacy of the case profoundly shifted the way that missing persons cases were approached in the years that followed. The intense national scrutiny that descended upon Houston after the discovery of the mass graves necessitated a complete, uncomfortable overhaul of the existing protocols. The police departments that had previously dismissed the disappearances as routine were forced to implement new strategies for handling cases involving missing teenagers, acknowledging that the assumptions of the past were not only outdated but deadly. This transformation was not immediate, nor was it perfect, but it marked the beginning of a shift toward a more proactive, empathetic, and thorough approach to law enforcement, where the initial assessment of a missing person is no longer clouded by the biases of their age or social status. The tragedy served as a brutal, necessary catalyst for this evolution in public safety, ensuring that the legacy of the victims was, in some small measure, the protection of the next generation. As we look back at the historical record, it is imperative that we maintain a clear, objective focus that avoids the temptation to romanticize the monster or the crimes. The horror of the event lies in its stark, unadorned reality, and to elevate the perpetrator in any way is to further victimize those whose lives were extinguished. The story must remain one that centers on the victims and the failure of the community to protect them, keeping their names and their dignity at the forefront of the narrative. It is a story of a darkness that was allowed to grow in the quiet corners of the city, and a story of the people who paid the ultimate price for the society's failure to act. The memory of the victims is the only true justice that can be served in the long shadow of such a disaster, a persistent, quiet demand that we remain vigilant in our defense of the most vulnerable among us. In the final analysis, the Houston mass murders remain one of the most chilling, sobering chapters in American criminal history, not because of the spectacle of the crimes, but because of the fundamental betrayal of the trust that forms the bedrock of society. The Candyman was a product of a world that refused to look, a world that preferred the comfort of a false reality over the difficult, often painful, responsibility of acknowledging the truth. The legacy of those 3 years is a permanent, haunting reminder of the fragility of that trust and the devastating consequences of its collapse. As we conclude this examination, we are left with the solemn recognition that our duty is not just to recount the history, but to honor the humanity of the lives lost by refusing to let their memory, or the lessons they left behind, fade into the oblivion of time. The Houston victims deserve to be more than a footnote in a dark historical archive. They deserve to be remembered as individuals whose lives, while tragically cut short, define the necessity of our ongoing, collective commitment to justice, empathy, and the unwavering protection of the innocent. Their story is a mirror held up to the face of society, reflecting the profound, inescapable reality that the safety of the community is a responsibility that belongs to us all, and that silence in the face of injustice is a luxury we can never, under any circumstances, afford to indulge. The profound silence that descended upon Houston in the aftermath of the investigations and the trials of the 1970s was not merely the absence of criminal activity. It was the heavy, contemplative quiet of a community fundamentally altered by the realization of its own vulnerability. As the years turned into decades, the narrative of the Dean Corll case became deeply woven into the local and national consciousness, serving as an indelible reminder of the intersection between predatory evil and systemic institutional failure. The process of memory in this context is not static. It is an evolving confrontation with a past that refuses to remain buried. The physical locations of the crimes, once sites of unimaginable horror, have been reclaimed by time, yet the psychological landscape remains forever marked. For those who lived through the era, the name of the Candyman is synonymous with the shattering of the suburban dream, a historical marker that demarcates a time before the loss of innocence and the era of cynical, necessary vigilance. The ongoing discourse surrounding this case serves a crucial, utilitarian purpose in the contemporary landscape of crime analysis and victim advocacy. It is a necessary component of a training and development for law enforcement and forensic experts, illustrating the catastrophic outcomes of ignoring patterns and the critical importance of treating every report of a missing person with the gravity it deserves. The failure of the Houston police in the early 70s is now a standard pedagogical tool used to teach the dangers of confirmation bias and the fatal consequences of bureaucratic inertia. By analyzing where the system broke down, future generations are equipped with a more comprehensive understanding of the protective measures required to prevent such a lapse from recurring. The lessons derived from the graves in the boat shed and the burial sites at High Island have translated into the development of sophisticated database systems and collaborative investigative protocols that prioritize the rapid identification of serial predation, ensuring that the tragedy of the past informs the security of the present. Beyond the administrative and investigative lessons, there exists a persistent, deeper societal requirement to honor the lives of the 28 victims through the lens of empathy and humanization. The media and popular culture frequently fall into the trap of focusing on the mechanics of the murder's pathology, inadvertently granting the perpetrator a level of significance that rightfully belongs to the victims. The ongoing commitment to this story must be one of reclamation, where the focus is shifted back to the potential that was extinguished. Each victim had a name, a family, and a future that was fundamentally theirs. They were not mere accessories to a macabre historical anecdote. Remembering them requires us to resist the urge to view the case as a gothic horror story and instead recognize it as a collection of 28 unique, individual tragedies that, when viewed together, represent a monumental failure of the human collective to provide safety for its youth. The persistence of their memory is a moral imperative, a barrier against the historical erasure of those who are marginalized in life and further diminished by the nature of their deaths. The survivors of the families who lost their sons during this dark period have carried a burden of grief that is largely unimaginable to the outside observer. Their endurance, their vocal advocacy for justice, and their ongoing fight to ensure that their loved ones were not forgotten are the most resilient elements of this story. They stood against the tide of official apathy, persistently challenging the narrative that their children had simply chosen to walk away from their homes. Their resolve in the face of institutional dismissal serves as a testament to the power of parental love and the refusal to be silenced by the weight of systemic neglect. The legacy of these families is one of strength, a foundational pillar in the story that centers the suffering of the innocent as the primary focus of the tragedy. Their continued presence in the discourse surrounding the case acts as a persistent demand for accountability, reminding us that the pain of such loss does not expire with the death of the perpetrator or the conclusion of the legal proceedings. In examining the broader scope of criminal history, the Houston mass murders continue to occupy a unique and unsettling position. They represent a bridge between the localized crimes of the mid-20th century and the more globalized, publicized era of the modern serial killer. The transition from the hidden, quiet horrors of the early 70s to the intense media scrutiny that characterized the subsequent decades of crime reporting was, in part, accelerated by the horrific nature of the Coral case. It set a standard for domestic terror that forced the nation to confront the reality that the most severe threats to public safety are often the ones that are closest to home, shielded by the mundane patterns of everyday life. This evolution in the public's understanding of serial violence has been both a benefit and a curse. It has fostered a culture of greater awareness and preventative measures, yet it has also contributed to a pervasive, sometimes paralyzing, sense of fear that defines much of modern existence. Navigating this tension is a central challenge for a society that seeks to be both safe and open, protective yet trustful. The final analysis of the Dean Coral case must acknowledge that justice, in its legal definition, was never truly capable of compensating for the scale of the loss. The incarceration of David Brooks and the subsequent imprisonment of Elmer Wayne Henley provided a necessary removal of the participants from society, but they could not restore the lives that were taken or erase the trauma inflicted upon the families and the wider community. True justice, in the context of such immense tragedy, is an elusive goal that shifts the responsibility from the courtroom to the broader public sphere. It is found in the continued commitment to the safety of the vulnerable, in the refusal to accept institutional apathy, and in the collective decision to remain vigilant against the encroachment of darkness in any form. The legacy of the Houston mass murders is, therefore, a living one. It is a mandate for action, a continuous call to protect the innocent from those who would use the facade of friendship to mask their predatory intent. As we look toward the future, the lessons of the early 70s remain as relevant as ever. The technological and forensic advancements of the modern age have provided us with powerful tools to detect and stop such crimes, yet the fundamental requirement for vigilance remains unchanged. We must continue to foster communities that are grounded in genuine connection and genuine care, where the safety of the individual is viewed as the collective responsibility of all. The horror of the past serves as the foundation upon which we must build a more resilient, empathetic, and protective future. By maintaining a clear, unwavering focus on the victims, and by refusing to allow the apathy of the past to define the actions of the present, we fulfill the duty of memory that we owe to those who were lost. The story of the Candyman is a dark, indelible chapter in the history of Houston, but it is also a story that concludes with a vital, enduring commitment to the protection of human life, an assertion that, even in the face of the most profound evil, the collective humanity of the community can and must remain steadfast in its defense of the innocent. This is the ultimate, necessary resolution to a tragedy that began in the dark and, through the long, painful work of investigation and remembrance, has finally been brought fully into the light, where it serves as a permanent, cautionary guide for all who seek to create a safer, more just world for the generations to follow. The final reckoning of the Dean Corll case involves not only the historical documentation of the atrocities, but also an ongoing confrontation with the cultural and social echoes that resonate long after the physical evidence has been processed and the judicial proceedings have concluded. The story of the Houston mass murders exists as a haunting monument to the vulnerability of childhood and the fragility of the social contract in the face of calculated, predatory evil. As we conclude this exploration, we must acknowledge that the narrative is not merely a record of death, but an urgent, persistent request for societal introspection. The tragedy reminds us that the most significant threats often masquerade behind the most innocuous facades, and that our collective failure to listen to the anxieties of the marginalized can have consequences that ripple through generations. The memory of the 28 victims serves as an enduring call for a proactive, vigilant, and profoundly empathetic approach to community safety, ensuring that the apathy of the past is never allowed to replicate itself in the future. The transformation of the Houston landscape in the wake of the discovery of the mass graves was not instantaneous, but rather a slow, painful process of healing and reevaluation. The community had to grapple with the realization that the horror had been occurring in plain sight, hidden by the very trust that defined their daily interactions. This realization forced a fundamental change in the way residents perceived their neighbors and their surroundings, introducing a level of caution that had previously been absent. The innocence of the era was not just lost, it was fundamentally dismantled, replaced by a more complex, guarded reality. For the families who were directly impacted, this change was not a theoretical shift, but a lived experience of grief and systemic betrayal that necessitated a lifetime of adjustment. They became the quiet witnesses to the cost of indifference, their lives forever tethered to the names of the sons they lost to the darkness that resided on their own streets. In the contemporary context, the legacy of this case continues to serve as an essential reference point for the study of serial homicide and the development of effective forensic and investigative techniques. The mistakes made by the authorities in the early 1970s, particularly the systemic dismissal of the missing youths as runaways, have become the primary case study for teaching law enforcement the critical importance of looking beyond the surface of a report. The evolution toward more sophisticated investigative protocols, which prioritize early intervention and the connection of seemingly isolated incidents, owes much to the hard-earned lessons of this period. The tragedy of the Houston mass murders forced a modernization of investigative methodologies that has undoubtedly saved lives in the decades since, as law enforcement has adopted a more proactive stance toward the protection of vulnerable youth. The horror of the past thus functions as a defensive wall, a historical safeguard built from the wreckage of failed institutional oversight. The responsibility for maintaining the memory of the victims rests with society at large, requiring a persistent commitment to humanizing the individuals who were erased by the actions of a monster. We must ensure that the story does not drift toward the sensational or the macabre, but remains grounded in the dignity of the lost. Each name on the list of victims represents a life that held intrinsic value, a story that was unfinished, and a potential that was cruelly denied. By keeping their identities at the center of the narrative, we resist the temptation to mythologize the killer and instead focus on the humanity that was trampled in the pursuit of his violent compulsions. This is a vital act of remembrance, ensuring that the legacy of the Houston mass murders is defined by the resilience of the victims' families and the community's eventual, if delayed, commitment to the truth, rather than by the actions of those who committed the crimes. Furthermore, the case of the Candyman underscores the necessity of intercommunity solidarity and the importance of creating environments where the well-being of the youth is treated as a foundational priority. When communities prioritize the connectivity and protection of their most vulnerable members, they build a natural defense against those who would exploit individual isolation. The tragedy in Houston was facilitated by a degree of social detachment that allowed the killers to operate without fear of exposure. By cultivating a culture of active, empathetic engagement, where the struggles and the safety of the young are collectively prioritized, society can begin to address the underlying conditions that predatory individuals exploit. This is a challenge that extends far beyond the history of any single crime. It is a fundamental test of the social fabric and the commitment of a community to look after its own, regardless of the individual circumstances of its members. As we reflect on the totality of this dark chapter, it is clear that the resolution to such profound tragedy is not found in a single, definitive conclusion, but in the ongoing, deliberate efforts of society to do better. The history of the Houston mass murders is a mirror, and when we look into it, we are confronted with the undeniable reality that the safety of our children is a responsibility that cannot be delegated to institutions alone. It requires the active, conscious participation of every member of the community to foster a culture of awareness and empathy. The survivors of this tragedy, through their enduring advocacy and their refusal to let the truth be obscured, have provided us with a roadmap for moving forward, a path paved with the difficult, necessary work of accountability and remembrance. Their courage in the face of such adversity is the ultimate beacon of light in an otherwise suffocatingly dark narrative. Ultimately, the Dean Corll case leaves us with a lingering, solemn awareness of the duality of human nature, a reminder that the same streets and the same neighborhoods can harbor both the most profound acts of communal kindness and the most horrific expressions of predatory malice. Navigating this reality requires us to maintain an unwavering commitment to the truth, even when it is difficult, and to remain constantly vigilant in our protection of the innocent. The legacy of the Houston victims is a challenge to the present. It is a challenge to reject apathy in all its forms, to hold our institutions to the highest standards of care and responsiveness, and to always, without exception, lend a voice to those who have been silenced. In fulfilling this duty, we honor the lives that were taken and we contribute, in our own small way, to the creation of a world where such a tragedy is not just a historical memory, but an impossibility. As this narrative concludes, we are left with the final, quiet certainty that the memory of the lost will continue to shape our understanding of justice and our commitment to the vulnerable. The story of the Candyman will always remain a dark, cautionary tale, but it is also a narrative that, in its conclusion, emphasizes the power of the human spirit to confront, to document, and to ultimately seek meaning in the aftermath of the unimaginable. We carry the weight of these lessons into the future, a collective burden that ensures that the suffering of the past is not wasted, but transformed into a catalyst for a more protective and vigilant world. The history of Houston is permanently marked by the events of the early 70s, yet it is also a history that has demonstrated a profound capacity for resilience and a renewed dedication to the sanctity of life. In the final estimation, this story is about the triumph of truth over the shadows of the past, a commitment to the living that begins with the respectful remembrance of the dead. It is a story that refuses to close, but instead continues to guide us as we navigate the complex, often dangerous, and ultimately beautiful pursuit of a safer, more just society, where the light of human empathy is strong enough to pierce the darkest corners and ensure that no one is ever again allowed to vanish into the night, unnoticed and unmourned. The narrative of the Houston mass murders inevitably leads to a profound reflection on the nature of justice and the limitations of the legal system when confronted with an evil of such unprecedented magnitude. While the incarceration of the surviving accomplices and the finality of Dean Corll's death brought a semblance of closure to the judicial proceedings, the broader search for justice remains a continuous, societal endeavor. Justice, in the aftermath of such a tragedy, cannot be reduced to the simple mechanical application of sentences. It must be understood as an ongoing commitment to the principles of empathy, vigilance, and the protection of the innocent. The case forces us to reckon with the reality that legal outcomes, no matter how severe, are often insufficient to balance the scales against the loss of 28 human lives. This limitation is not a reflection of the failure of the law, but rather an acknowledgement of the absolute, irreversible nature of the crimes committed. The true weight of justice lies in the collective memory of the victims, the enduring support for the families, and the systemic changes that prioritize the safety and well-being of the most vulnerable members of society above all else. In considering the long-term impact on the city of Houston, it is evident that the discovery of the mass graves functioned as a watershed moment that permanently altered the relationship between the citizenry and the protective institutions of the state. The initial institutional failure to recognize the pattern of disappearances was a critical, fatal error that allowed the predation to continue for 3 years, and the subsequent reckoning was both public and deeply painful. This experience necessitated a transformation in the civic culture, fostering a greater demand for accountability and a heightened level of awareness regarding the potential for threats within the suburban fabric. Houston emerged from this dark period with a more skeptical, guarded perspective, a mindset that reflected the hard-won wisdom of a community that had seen its illusions of safety shattered. This evolution in the civic psyche was a necessary response to the reality of the danger, serving as a protective mechanism that sought to prevent the recurrence of such institutional myopia in the future. The educational value of the Dean Corll case for modern forensic and investigative practice cannot be overstated. By providing a detailed, clinical examination of the methods, patterns, and errors involved in the investigation, the case continues to inform the development of sophisticated tools that enhance the efficiency of law enforcement. Modern techniques such as behavioral profiling, the integration of multi-jurisdictional databases, and the implementation of proactive, community-based policing strategies are, in part, the products of a professional landscape that has been profoundly shaped by the failures of the past. The institutional memory of the Houston Police Department, and indeed the broader law enforcement community, has been permanently marked by the shadow of the Candyman, ensuring that the warning signs of serial predation are treated with an intensity that was tragically absent in the early 1970s. This technical progress represents a significant, if belated, tribute to the victims, whose deaths helped forge the tools necessary to protect the generations that followed. We must also contemplate the role of the accomplices within the narrative, not as mere villains, but as manifestations of the corrosive influence of charismatic, predatory leadership. David Brooks and Elmer Wayne Henley were young men whose moral foundations were systematically dismantled by Dean Corll, an example of how the vulnerability of youth can be weaponized with devastating effectiveness. This aspect of the case serves as a sober warning regarding the importance of youth mentorship, the influence of peer associations, and the need for structural support systems that shield young people from individuals who seek to exploit their alienation or desire for inclusion. Understanding the psychology of the accomplices is vital to developing preventative strategies that target the environments in which such predatory relationships are formed, highlighting the critical importance of early intervention and the cultivation of healthy, positive influences during the formative years of adolescence. The archival preservation of this history is essential to the duty of remembrance. As time passes and the events of 1970 to 1973 fade from the direct experience of the public, the formal documentation of the case becomes the primary vessel for the preservation of the truth. This archival work includes not only the legal records and the testimonies of the witnesses, but also the oral histories of the families, the media archives of the era, and the forensic reports that documented the recovery of the bodies. By maintaining a comprehensive, accessible, and respectful record, we ensure that the lessons of the tragedy remain available to those who seek to understand the complexities of human nature and the vital importance of societal protection. This commitment to the truth is the ultimate, non-negotiable requirement of a society that wishes to prevent the repetition of its darkest moments. The psychological resilience of the victims' families, who have persisted through decades of loss, and the persistent memory of their loved ones, remains a testament to the strength of the human spirit. Their willingness to confront the details of the murders, to participate in the legal and investigative processes, and to share their stories with the public is a profound act of courage that has helped to keep the memory of the victims alive. Their endurance serves as an inspiration to others who have experienced similar tragedies, highlighting the power of collective support and the importance of ensuring that the names of the lost are never forgotten. The families have collectively transformed their private suffering into a public demand for safety and accountability, acting as a moral conscience that ensures the narrative of the case remains focused on the human impact of the crimes. In the final assessment, the story of the Candyman is a narrative that fundamentally questions the nature of safety in a modern society. It challenges us to look beyond the surface of our surroundings, to be more attentive to the needs and the behaviors of our neighbors, and to maintain a critical perspective on the institutions that we rely upon for our security. The story does not have a happy ending, nor does it offer a simple solution to the problem of evil. Instead, it offers a stark, clear understanding of the risks that persist in the absence of empathy and vigilance. By engaging with this narrative, we commit ourselves to a state of constant awareness, ensuring that the lessons of the Houston mass murders are woven into the very fabric of our ongoing efforts to create a safer, more just world for everyone. The legacy of the 28 victims is therefore a living legacy, one that continues to influence our understanding of crime, our commitment to justice, and our protective instincts toward the young. We conclude this exploration with the acknowledgement that the darkness of the past is not something that can be erased, but it is something that can be understood, processed, and ultimately used to build a stronger defense against the return of such horrors. The light of human consciousness, when directed with clarity and purpose, is sufficient to reveal even the deepest shadows of our history, and it is in that light that we find the capacity to learn, to change, and to protect the most vulnerable among us. As we look to the future, we carry the weight of these lessons with us, not as a burden, but as guiding principles that inform our collective dedication to the preservation of life and the unwavering pursuit of a reality where the safety of the individual is held as a sacred, collective responsibility. This final reflection serves as a testament to the enduring significance of the Houston tragedy, ensuring that it remains a cornerstone of our historical knowledge, a vital reminder of the imperative of care, and an unshakable affirmation that no life, regardless of its duration or its circumstances, is ever truly forgotten by those who choose to remember with the truth as their guiding star. The journey through the harrowing history of Dean Corll, the figure infamously known as the Candyman, brings us to a final, contemplative juncture where we must synthesize the entirety of this investigation into a cohesive understanding of its enduring significance. Over the course of these reflections, we have traversed the dark corridors of a suburban nightmare, scrutinized the systemic failures of an indifferent institutional era, and borne witness to the immense, cascading grief of 28 families. This exhaustive examination has not been intended to merely catalog the graphic details of the violence, but rather to articulate the profound, life-altering impact that the absence of societal empathy can have on the most vulnerable among us. As we stand at the end of this chronicle, it is vital to recognize that the history of the 1970s Houston mass murders is not confined to a distant past, but serves as a perennial, cautionary beacon that illuminates the necessity of constant, unwavering vigilance. The story remains a stark testament to the reality that evil does not always approach with an aggressive display of force, but often maneuvers through the mundane, exploiting the very trust that sustains the structure of our daily lives. The legacy of these crimes is fundamentally anchored in the resilience of the survivors and the families who, through their persistent refusal to let their loved ones be forgotten, became the true architects of justice in the long, dark aftermath of the tragedy. Their individual and collective narratives have served as a persistent challenge to the historical tendency to prioritize the perpetrator's perspective, forcing a pivot toward the humanity of the victims and the gravity of the loss. By documenting the pain, the struggle, and the eventual, albeit imperfect, recovery of these families, we have sought to establish a record that honors the existence of each young man who was cruelly taken from the world. This focus on the human dimension of the catastrophe is the most essential component of our reflection, as it reclaims the narrative from the darkness of the crime and anchors it in the enduring memory of those who were stolen. The commitment to this humanization is a vital component of justice, ensuring that the legacy of the victims is not defined by the violence of their deaths, but by the significance of the lives they were entitled to lead. Looking back at the structural failures that define the early investigative response, it is clear that the lack of institutional imagination and the prevalence of systemic bias were the primary enablers of Coral's continued reign of terror. The categorization of these disappearances as runaways was a catastrophic, lethal error that highlights the dangers of relying upon preconceived notions when evaluating the reality of a threat. This institutional apathy, while a product of a different time, offers a universal lesson that must remain at the forefront of modern protective practice. The responsibility of authority is not merely to enforce the law, but to listen with empathy, to investigate with depth, and to acknowledge that the silence surrounding an individual's disappearance is often the most significant, alarming piece of evidence. In the modern era, where information is more accessible and interagency collaboration has been significantly improved, the lesson remains as potent as ever. The failure to act on the early warning signs of a predator is a failure that can result in the ultimate, tragic loss of human life. The archival preservation of this case, including the legal transcripts, the forensic investigations, and the oral accounts of those impacted, serves as a crucial defensive measure against the erasure of history. By ensuring that these records remain a part of our collective knowledge, we provide a foundation for future generations to understand the complexities of this specific disaster and to apply its lessons to the challenges of their own time. The meticulous documentation of the evidence, while painful to revisit, is a necessary burden that guards against the revisionist tendencies of the public consciousness. It ensures that the reality of the horror is never diminished and that the gravity of the institutional failure remains a clear, indisputable part of the historical record. The truth, regardless of how dark or uncomfortable it may be, is the only foundation upon which an authentic, enduring justice can be built. Furthermore, we must address the importance of cultivating societal environments that prioritize the well-being and the connectivity of our youth, as the exploitation of teenage vulnerability was a core component of the Candyman's predatory methodology. The alienation of the individual, whether through economic instability or the breakdown of familial support systems, creates a vacuum that individuals like Coral are eager to fill. The challenge of the future is to replace these vacuums with robust networks of support, engagement, and protection, ensuring that every young person feels seen, valued, and safe within their community. This proactive approach to communal safety is the ultimate preventative measure against the encroachment of predatory violence. It is an acknowledgement that the strength of our communities is measured by how well we protect those who are just beginning their journey into adulthood, and by our capacity to offer them a safe, supportive space in which to grow and thrive. As we bring this narrative to a close, we are left with a solemn recognition that the Houston mass murders are a permanent part of our history, a chapter that reminds us of the fragility of the peace we often take for granted. We have navigated the depths of this tragedy with the goal of fostering a deeper, more empathetic understanding of the cost of violence and the imperative of collective protection. We have honored the victims by ensuring their names and their stories are central to our investigation, and we have scrutinized the failures of the past to illuminate the path toward a more vigilant, protective future. The darkness of the 1970s in Houston has been documented, processed, and ultimately set within the context of our historical understanding, where it serves as a final, quiet, yet powerful reminder of the precious, irreplaceable nature of human life. We carry this memory forward not as a source of paralyzing fear, but as a source of strength, a guiding principle that reinforces our commitment to the values of empathy, integrity, and the unwavering defense of the innocent. The conclusion of this series of reflections is an assertion that the memory of the lost is a transformative force, capable of driving change and fostering a more protective awareness within the societal consciousness. The story of the 28 victims does not end here. It continues to reside in the ongoing work of justice, the continuous improvement of our protective systems, and the persistent, quiet, and meaningful efforts of those who work every day to ensure that the vulnerable are kept safe from harm. The legacy of the Candyman is a dark, painful, and necessary reminder of what can happen when a community turns its back on its own, but it is also a narrative that highlights the potential for the light of human empathy to guide us toward a more just, aware, and protective reality. We conclude this journey with a firm, unshakable conviction that by remembering the past with truth and clarity, we protect the future with the dedication and the care that every human life deserves. This is the ultimate fulfillment of our responsibility as observers and historians, to ensure that the story is told in full, with the dignity and the solemnity that the victims and their families deserve, thereby transforming the memory of a profound disaster into an enduring, protective force for good in the world. As the echoes of this dark chapter finally fade into the archive of history, we remain steadfast in our collective vow to keep the light burning for those who were lost, ensuring that their names, their stories, and their potential are never surrendered to the silence of the night, but remain forever illuminated in the protective awareness of the generations that follow. The culmination of our exhaustive exploration into the shadow-drenched history of Dean Corll brings us to a final, meditative space where the weight of historical truth rests upon our collective shoulders. Throughout these chapters, we have carefully navigated the intricate and agonizing details of a crime that profoundly scarred the American landscape, moving beyond the superficiality of the headlines to confront the chilling, systemic realities that permitted such absolute carnage to occur. This narrative is not merely a chronicle of death. It is an enduring inquiry into the nature of institutional indifference, the vulnerability of the marginalized, and the persistent, quiet demand for accountability that persists long after the perpetrators have met their end. As we finalize our perspective on these events, it is imperative to acknowledge that the story of the Houston mass murders serves as a fundamental reference point for any serious engagement with the history of criminal predation, offering a stark, uncompromising look at what happens when the mechanisms of society fail to recognize, protect, and value its most vulnerable members. The process of memory, in the context of such a profound tragedy, is an active, ongoing effort of humanization. We have endeavored throughout this account to center the lives of the 28 victims, refusing to allow their identities to be subsumed by the notoriety of the monster who took them. Their lives were the bedrock of this investigation, and their absence remains the loudest echo in the history of the Heights and the surrounding Houston neighborhoods. To look back at the early 70s is to witness a community in the throes of a forced awakening, where the comfort of familiar suburban structures was violently dismantled by the revelation of the horror hiding in plain sight. This transformation of perspective, while painful, was essential to the community's ability to move forward, as it necessitated a fundamental shift in how the citizenry engaged with its institutions and how it perceived the obligations of collective safety. The memory of the lost is, in this sense, a living legacy that continues to demand our attention, our empathy, and our steadfast commitment to the truth. In our analysis of the legal and forensic aftermath, we have observed that the mechanisms of justice were fundamentally hampered by the enormity of the crimes, as no sentence or institutional reform could ever truly compensate for the life lost. Yet, the legal record remains a vital vessel for the facts, a detailed, clinical account that serves as a barrier against the historical revisionism that often attempts to minimize the gravity of such events. By documenting the testimonies of the survivors and the evidence presented during the trials of David Brooks and Elmer Wayne Henley, we have created a repository of truth that stands as a firm rebuke to those who would seek to downplay the systemic failures of the era. The legal proceedings were not just about the determination of guilt. They were about the painful, public articulation of a reality that the city had desperately tried to ignore, providing a foundational record upon which all subsequent historical inquiries must rely. Furthermore, we must emphasize the critical role of institutional memory in preventing the recurrence of such a disaster. The shift in investigative protocols that followed the discovery of the mass graves was not a minor adjustment, but a structural overhaul of how law enforcement approaches the missing and the exploited. The transition from a dismissive, bias-prone investigative framework to one that prioritizes the rapid, comprehensive identification of threats has been the most significant, if belated, victory born from the ruins of the 1970s. This legacy of improved public safety is a testament to the fact that societies possess the capacity to learn, to grow, and to reform their institutions in the wake of profound trauma. It is a commitment to the living that begins with the acknowledgement of the failures of the past, ensuring that the warning signs of predation, however subtle or seemingly insignificant, are met with the full force of investigative scrutiny and societal protection. The psychological dimension of this history remains complex, as it involves not only the suffering of the victims' families, but also the broader, enduring impact on a society that had to reconcile its perceptions of safety with the reality of its own fragility. The way in which the media and the public consumed the story, initially with skepticism and later with a numbing, overwhelming horror, reflects the challenges of communicating such immense trauma within a cultural framework that is often ill-equipped to handle it. By maintaining a focus on the ethical responsibility of storytelling, we have sought to navigate this terrain with the care that is due to those who remain in the shadow of the tragedy. This commitment to an ethical narrative is not merely a stylistic choice. It is a fundamental requirement of the duty we owe to the truth and to the dignity of those whose stories we are entrusted to recount. As we conclude this profound examination, we must reiterate that the lessons derived from the Dean Corll case are not relics of a bygone era. They are dynamic, necessary principles that guide our engagement with the present. The vigilance required to protect the vulnerable is a constant, unyielding demand that does not expire with the passage of time or the technological advancements of the modern age. It requires an active, persistent participation in the life of our communities, a refusal to accept the silence of the marginalized, and a commitment to hold our institutions to the highest standards of responsiveness and care. The tragedy of the Houston mass murders remains a dark, indelible milestone in our collective understanding, a milestone that serves as a permanent, silent guidepost for the ongoing, complex pursuit of a more secure, empathetic, and truly protective world. Ultimately, the power of this history to influence our future lies in our collective willingness to look directly into the darkness and to emerge with a renewed dedication to the sanctity of life. We do not look back to dwell in the horror, but to extract the wisdom that is necessary to prevent its return. We look back to honor the human spirit that survived the collapse of the social order and to validate the voices of those who, for years, cried out in a wilderness of institutional neglect. The story of the 28 victims is a profound reminder that we are all, in some measure, the keepers of each other's safety, and that our failures to fulfill this duty have real, devastating consequences. In fulfilling our role as witnesses to this history, we contribute to the vital, ongoing process of restoration and protection, ensuring that the light of our shared commitment is strong enough to pierce the shadows of the past and to guide us toward a future defined by vigilance, compassion, and an unshakable defense of the innocent. This brings us to the final realization that the story of the Candyman is fundamentally a narrative about the power of the truth to endure. Despite the years of silence, the efforts at concealment, and the overwhelming weight of the horror, the truth eventually emerged, demanding a reckoning that could not be denied. That truth, once brought into the light, has remained a powerful force for change, a persistent reminder of the potential for profound tragedy and the equally potent potential for societal growth and institutional reform. As the final words of this series of reflections settle into the historical record, we hold the conviction that the memory of the Houston victims will continue to serve as a vital, necessary guardrail for our society, an affirmation of our collective responsibility to protect the precious, fragile life that exists within our communities. The journey has been difficult, the subject matter agonizing, and the implications deep, yet the commitment to telling this story remains the most important, honorable, and necessary pursuit we can undertake to ensure that the mistakes of the past are never forgotten, and that the promise of a safer, more just world remains the guiding star for all our future endeavors. The archive is now set, the testimony recorded, and the memory secured, leaving us with the lasting resolve to stand against the dark and to always, without hesitation, protect those who are the most vulnerable among us.